Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Wendi Williams, and I'm very excited to host the first of our Wednesdays with Wendi with two of my colleagues, Doctors Sara Buckingham and Jessica Jackson, who are going to be talking with me a little bit about their work, and we'll be drawing some of the connections to how they fit with one of my presidential initiatives, 100 Psychologists Rising. But let's sort of dial back a little bit and bring ourselves into the conversation so that it makes much more sense for all of us. So you may have guessed, I am running for APA president. That's what the logo on the back there says, and that's what we've been promoting for the last few months. And one of the things that feels really, really important for us to do is to elevate and make folks more familiar with the presidential initiatives, as well as the platform that we're running on, which is Radically Well Together, what we mean by that. And so what I have thought to do is that over the course of the next few months is to invite colleagues who are doing some of the work that exemplifies what we mean by the initiatives that we have in front of us. And so my two colleagues here, Doctors Jackson and Buckingham, are here to do that. Just as a recap, there are three initiatives that we're working on within Radically Well Together. The first is 100 Psychologists Rising. Again, that will be the focus of today's conversation. Next, we'll focus on teen and youth wellness, and then ultimately wellness at work. And so these conversations are ways to bring our community into the conversation with us, familiarize you all with the initiatives of the campaign, and invite you to also explore some of the work of our colleagues. We are all doing some really important, impactful work. And part of the ways in which we're radically well together is when we amplify each other and the work that we're doing in various communities. But first, let me introduce you to our guest. So today we have Dr. Jessica Jackson. Jessica is, or Dr. Jackson, I should say, is an award-winning licensed psychologist and mental health equity advocate. She's the founder of Therapy is for Everyone, psychological and consultation services out of Houston, Texas, which is a mental health-based practice providing expert care, mental health startup advisory services. So she's teaching people how to do what she does, which is so important. Dr. Jackson is also the co-founder of the nonprofit community Communicating Racefully, which is focused on teaching youth and their caregivers how to have conversations about race and racism. Her research has focused on reducing barriers to treatment for underserved populations. She is a regular media contributor and serves as an elected member of the American Psychological Association Board for the Advancement of Psychology in the Public Interest, as well as the vice chair of Therapist in Tech and the chair of the APA Mental Health Technology Advisory Committee. It's fair to say that Dr. Jackson is busy, but also busy doing work that I think connects for all of us and helps us to expand our understanding of how we can be more influential and impactful in the field. So Dr. Buckingham, Dr. Sara Buckingham is a licensed psychologist and an associate professor of psychology at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, where she serves in Alaska's sole APA-accredited clinical community psychology program. Her research, practice, teaching, and advocacy work integrate clinical, community, and cultural psychology. Broadly, her work centers on how communities and their members, how communities and their members well, let me finish what I'm doing here, then I'll fix that. How communities and their members, oh, wow. Oh gosh. So broadly, her work centers on how communities and their members shape acculturation, resilience, a sense of community and well-being among newcomer and indigenous community members. Dr. Buckingham strives to be a good partner in the work towards equity, justice, and liberation. She leads the Crossroads Research Collective, which is a community-engaged research action team that partners with communities to answer critical questions of interest to them to catalyze action. Dr. Buckingham also has a small private practice that focuses on culturally responsive clinical community assessment and treatment services for forced migrant community members. She serves in a number of leadership roles in psychology, including as the representative of the Society for Community Research and Action to the APA Council of Representatives, where we met. Dr. Buckingham also thrives in relationship, whether it's with humans, canines, and or plant life. So we're really super excited to have Dr. Buckingham here with us today as well. What I'm going to do just for our purposes is also focus on spotlighting our panelists so that members who are joining our conversation can comfortably do so. And we're thanking folks who are here with us today and appreciative of your time and your attention. Okay. So I wanted to share really briefly a little bit about the initiative and what is meant from an umbrella sense, 30,000 feet view, if you will, of 100 Psychologists Rising. What is that? What do you mean? What I believe so strongly and powerfully is that we have colleagues like my two beloved colleagues here who are doing impactful and important work all across the globe. And their work is so very much vital and is contributing to a collective sense of wellness. We don't highlight it enough, but it's deeply important. And it is the work that is really helping us to make a difference and move the needle in a collective sense of wellness. Psychology sometimes happens in one-to-one or group settings in clinical practices or in consultation. But a lot of what we do in our work has the potential to have greater and more broader impact. And so even as I read the bios of our colleagues, you can see where their leadership, their work with other psychologists in governance spaces within the American Psychological Association and otherwise provides a platform for their work to have more further reach. And so while we may do our research and our clinical practice in pretty traditional settings, it's also very true and important to note the ways in which that work, when extended outward and focused to the global community, can have such a powerful and impact on wellness. So I believe, and the 100 Psychologists Rising initiative is an empowering campaign that is deeply rooted in the transformative principles and power of movement work. Our goal is to forge a global alliance of psychologists who leverage their local and psychological expertise to amplify the importance of wellness. We aspire to co-create pathways for access to wellness and to emphasize the significance of regional cultural approaches in fostering well-being in diverse contexts. That can mean a lot of different things, and that's the power of our work in our field. And so again, I'm very, very thrilled today to have my two colleagues whose work I believe really does embody notions of collective wellness and the possibilities afforded to all of us and the potential of psychologists' work broadly as an example of the types of initiatives that we will amplify through the 100 Psychologists Rising initiative. So Drs. Jackson and Buckingham, welcome so much. So glad to have you here and just to be in community with us. I want to just make some room for you to add your voices to the space and warm it with your presence as well.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to dive into the conversation, to really just be able to chat about the work psychologists are doing. I think we're so nuanced and we have so many skills despite, I think the focus often in grad school is clinical work and research and coursework. There's so many things that we can do to leverage our skills. So I'm excited to chat today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here as well and to talk with both of you. I oftentimes when I think about the work that we do, it is aimed at this global wellness, and yet oftentimes, especially in the clinical realm, we end up focusing so much on individual illness and treating that illness when really a lot of what we're treating is coming from systemic ills in our society. And so in order to move us towards wellness, we have to think about it in this much more global movement-based lens. So I'm really excited to be here. Glad to have this conversation. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellence. It's exciting because you see the vision, and that's really, really powerful to me. That's really, really powerful. So we'll start with our first question, which is for each of you to share with us about the work that you do. So please tell us everything that we want to know and how that work that you do in the world as a psychologist contributes to collective wellness, at least your vision in view of that. Either of you can start and we'll piggyback.
Do you want to go for it, Dr. Jackson?
Sure. So I think the work that I'm doing right now, I would say, is two paths. I am doing a lot of work in digital mental health, which a large part for me, that work, why it's important, especially for psychologists, is I have a little bit of idealism about it. I think about it in the sense that this is an opportunity for us to get psychology right. If you think about what's happening with technology, it's similar to kind of the revolution that happened in the early 1900s when we were talking about machines and all of these things and how it changed the way we work. That's when the 5-day work week started. Like all of it really changed how society was. Technology is doing the same thing right now. It is changing how we interact, how we communicate, how we see one another, like all of these ways. And because a lot of it is newer, so not that it was created this year, but newer compared to psychology, there's still a lot of time for us to integrate A lot of the social justice work, really thinking about inclusive psychology, a global lens into these products and services that are being built. So in 10, 20, 30 years, psychologists are not having to do what we do now, which is modify and adapt interventions as they come up. And so that's a lot of the work that I do, kind of thinking about technology and digital mental health. And then the other kind of work I do is related to conversations about racism and racial trauma, racial stress. So I do have a nonprofit with Dr. Farzana Salim. She works, does a lot of pediatric work. And so together we kind of think through and do workshops working with people about how to have conversations. I tell people all of the time, our children do not turn 18 and all of a sudden they're able to deal with these experiences. And so through some of that work, I do consulting with like the United Nations on their anti-racism and mental health initiative, and other organizations where we go in and just kind of teach people communication skills, and having a level of comfort to have those conversations.
Wonderful. I cannot wait to dive in a bit more and ask a bit more about that. Dr. Buckingham, how about you?
Sure. So as you heard, I define myself as a clinical community psychologist. Very much is the work that I'm doing embedded in my university system. It's also where my degree comes from. Most people are very familiar with clinical psychology, but might not be as familiar with community psych. The community psych side of things goes beyond that individual level focus, and it integrates a focus on systems and how systems shape our well-being, our health, and empowerment at that community level. And so a lot of my work is looking at community transition. More and more people are on the move. I've lived in probably a dozen different communities over the span of my lifetime and career. And we see that community change happening all of the time. So my work is really looking at how newcomers shape communities that they come into and how communities are welcoming of the new community members that join, or on the other hand, oftentimes exclusionary, and what that means ultimately for our collective sense of well-being. So my paid employment is largely within a university system. As you heard, I'm an associate professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage. I mostly work in a PhD program that is clinical community, and it has a rural Indigenous emphasis to it. And so in that work, I get to work with PhD students. I teach clinical community and research courses. I get to conduct a lot of community engaged research that catalyzes community action with an incredible group of not only PhD students and other faculty members, but community members that are really working to develop these projects to make meaningful changes in the work that we're doing. Beyond that, I also am still kind of involved in the clinical world, and my work there is really looking at how do we have culturally responsive services for forced migrant populations. So I do a lot with asylum seekers, refugees, folks that have joined our community, not necessarily by choice, but because they were experiencing oppression in the communities they previously called home, and how to not only intervene with some of the trauma that has occurred, but work to help them transform the communities that they're living in order to promote wellness. So that work involves assessment for like psychological affidavits for asylum cases, as well as intervention at the group, family, and individual levels.
You know, one of the things that strikes me for the two of you, thank you so much, Dr. Buckingham, for sharing your work, is that you've both crafted these pieces of work that you're doing and or around the, as you say, Dr. Buckingham, what you do in your day job or what you're paid for, how you framed it, right? And, you know, I wonder about how you've crafted service opportunities and work that you do in that way. In your conception of what the psychologist's role is in the world, how, from your own conception of your identity as a psychologist, do you think about your role in the world? And I'm projecting to imagine that the additional volunteer work that you do, if you will, contributes to your definition of who you are supposed to be, what the role of a psychologist is in the world.
I'm happy to jump in. I think
Okay.
the word I would use to describe the role that I see as psychologist and myself in the world is collaborator. I think about it, the analogy I think about in my mind is like when you go to get your hair done, when you go to a hair salon.
Okay.
For anyone who's gone to a hair salon, you already have a vision of what you want. For the most part, you have seen something, whether it's a picture in a magazine, Instagram, somewhere. So you're going to them and you're essentially collaborating. You need their expertise of the stylist to get what you're trying to get to, but you already have the hair, you already have the vision, you already have what is needed. You just need them to really work together with you to execute. And that's how I see the role of psychologist and myself, is that it is not for me to come into spaces in communities, in organizations and tell them what to do. It is to collaborate with them to execute as the expert related to psychology. They're already going to have the vision. They already have some resource. They've probably already done some work. They're coming in it and saying, how do we work together to get this outcome that we have for our vision? And that is how I see myself. And I think the role of many psychologists in these spaces is like, how do you show up in this way where, and when I think of collaboration, it's because it takes two people, right? Like when you're collaborating, it takes more than one. We both have to be a part to be able to execute, which is why we're here. You can't have one without the other. And that's really how I think about that work.
Where did you get that from?
Great question.
Like, where did that come from? Was that in graduate school? Was that taught in graduate school?
I don't believe it was taught in graduate school. I would actually say coming more from like family, thinking the way that my family operates, how they see themselves in community, in neighborhood. You know, on the Mental Health Technology Advisory Committee that I chair, our kind of framework for working with technology and psychologists is an ecosystem. And that's kind of the way that I grew up in neighborhoods. You need everyone to exist for everyone to thrive. And when people think ecosystems, I think about it like, I can't stand bugs, but I know the bugs are needed in the ecosystem, right? So like without certain bugs, certain food couldn't grow the way it needed. Like there's all of these ways. And so even though I don't like it, it is needed in order for me to get what I need. And so that's what I think about communities. There are people in your community you may not agree with, you may not always like, but you need both of you to have community. So I think that is kind of where I get the idea of collaboration, is that's how I was raised. It's like how you see people in community. Doesn't matter if you think they can do something for you or not, they're still needed in order for you to exist in some way.
I ask because I kind of facetiously, Dr. Jackson, to be quite honest. Yeah, I don't know most psychology programs that necessarily have that perspective, though, to be quite honest, Dr. Buckingham, perhaps in a community psych space, there's a bit more of that, but our field tends to have a little bit more individualism attached to it. And so again, the volunteerism, its service, its effort, and its work, but it is on top of all the other things that you do. And both of you have pretty long list of extracurricular or extra additional pieces that are aspects of your career that you're engaged in, and you engage because you're a psychologist, but it's on top of. And so just wondering where that comes from for you. Dr. Buckingham, how about you? What is the role of the psychologist in the world? And, how do you conceive of your identity, yourself as a professional?
Yeah, thanks for that. I want to go back to Dr. Jackson's comment about collaborator, because partner is what comes to mind for me first. And so I'm not going to belabor a lot of the fantastic points that Dr. Jackson already made, but I do want to turn to the comment that you made about, perhaps there's more space for something like that in the community psychology program. And I think in some ways, perhaps there's certainly a value set that offers up partnership and collaboration and prizes it, and prizes research done in community, right? At serving community needs in collaboration with people who are impacted by whatever research question, right? We might have. And I also think that, the way in which higher education is structured and the way that PhD programs are structured and kind of the time limitation of them and the way that people move into community in order to access a PhD with the intention of oftentimes leaving community after that
Mhm,
PhD, or at
mhm,
least for
mhm,
internship, for postdoc, before that, first position, makes it really hard to do that in practice, right? How do you have a
mhm,
like a clinical community psychology student come into a place for 5 years, develop community partnerships, truly do work in community at
mhm,
the wishes of community members, while also speaking to their committee, right?
mhm.
To whoever at the university is determining whether that research is rigorous.
Ah,
And to do that in such a short period of time. And so
mhm,
when I oftentimes think and am encouraging students to work in that way,
mhm,
we're also thinking about how do we step into relationships that are
mhm,
already existing, right?
mhm,
Get to
mhm,
know community needs,
mhm,
capitalize on those strengths, because to be frank, probably about half my students are not from the community in
mhm,
which we live.
mhm.
And so it does
Mm.
create a lot of challenges. So I do think there is space for that.
Yeah,
But perhaps the real is a little different than the ideal. um,
absolutely.
I
Oh,
might
please
turn
finish.
to, yeah, I also wanted to share that I think the role of a psychologist is also as kind of an interpreter or a
Mm,
translator in that way too, because we oftentimes have a lot of tools and knowledge and ability to access things
mhm.
in ways that other people don't always.
Yes.
And so oftentimes it is our role to one, listen and to understand,
Mhm,
and then to work to bring those tools to bear, to bring frameworks to bear, to be
mhm,
able to share and help people to engage in divergent thinking in order to do that work as well.
mm, mm, mm. You both have said so many things. I'm going to stay focused. But, one of the things that you talked about, well, maybe I won't stay too focused because they're important. One of the things you talked about, um, this idea of rigor, the work in communities whose lives are, and whose experiences are worthy of being studied, but then also how do we engage that work that honors the dignity of the people with whom we're working? And so when we're starting to talk about a broader perspective of expanding and thinking about wellness, and wellness that really addresses root cause systemic and structural challenges to folks' wellness, this really starts to unpack a sense of some of the tensions that might exist in our work in our field. And I know this was not a question that I initially shared with you that I would ask, but I feel like we're in a space where I might be able to pose that question to you in terms of those types of tensions that might exist in our work and just kind of your reactions to that, how you respond to that. What are your thoughts about that?
Mhm. I think for me, it was one of the comments I was going to add because when we talked about grad school, I think the
Mhm.
way that many psychologists are trained in grad school is that we are the healer individually. And I encourage people to push back on that. And you see it also on social media, all these things, and it's like, who heals the healer? And for me, I'm always like, well, who appointed you the healer? Right? Like, I don't know. But the idea that you are the healer is that it is all within you individually. And I think that makes it difficult for them people to see their work as a leader or in a systems way or in a community because you feel like it's all in you, right? You're
Mhm.
not taught how to teach other people to help them. This idea that when, as psychologists, you graduate, you have a PhD or a PsyD, people immediately think of you as a leader in many of the spaces you go into. And
Mhm.
I think that that's some of the tension. That's a hard thing to do if you feel like you are the tool as the healer. How do you lead people as you, right? So
Mhm.
it's the way that we are taught in that way that I think creates the tension. And to
Mhm.
a degree, there's almost some unlearning that has to do when you get in those spaces and very quickly realize it's really not about you. You're more of the conduit, right? That's why it's a collaboration. To Dr. Buckingham's point, like you
Partnership.
are the interpreter. And I
Mhm.
think that that is what makes good leaders in psychologists is when they recognize that you are the piece that it just kind of goes through, then you
Mhm.
are able to see things from a systems level. How do I take this from systems to individual? How do I work within this organization? But if you were the only tool, it becomes difficult to figure out how do I make that go wider because I'm only trained to see it as like I am almost like I'm the magic. I am it. Without me, it doesn't exist type of thing.
Oh, gosh. Mm. Dr. Buckingham,
Yeah.
what more would you add to that? I really appreciate your comments, Dr. Jackson.
Yeah, that is just so beautifully said. I don't know how to follow up on that, Dr. Jackson. But no, I agree wholeheartedly. I
Mhm.
also think that, one of the big challenges that we have in graduate school is
Mhm.
we teach students how to critique rigor, right? Or rigor of research. And oftentimes the research base that people are pulling from is research that was conducted by people who look like me with people who look like me, um,
Mhm.
who
Mhm.
are, very much a statistical minority in our society
Yeah.
and coming from a very particular privileged lens.
Mhm.
And so it is something that we have to really push back on at the graduate level too,
Yeah.
as we're working with students, is to help students take not only kind of a critical lens towards how we might view rigor in research, but a
Yeah.
critical lens towards positionality
Mhm.
in research, and understanding how our positionality shapes the research questions we choose to ask, right?
Mm.
How we choose that, how we choose to ask them, how we choose to share those findings out in the world,
Mhm.
and how that is shaped by our field and who is
Yes.
choosing, right, how
Mhm.
research is talked about. And so there needs to be a lot of critical reflexivity that
Yes. Yes.
happens in graduate education and beyond graduate education, as Dr. Jackson was sharing, that
Mhm.
unlearning,
Mhm.
because we privilege, or our field privileges, what
Mhm.
we would call, the peer-reviewed
Yeah.
research in journal articles, which tends to be incredibly post-positivist,
Mhm.
that doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily reflect realities, is oftentimes quite colonial in nature.
Mhm.
And we end up uh, really marginalizing so much of the research that has been conducted and
Mm.
is continuously conducted by communities around us,
Mhm.
that is oftentimes passed on and shared in ways that don't look like a peer-reviewed journal article,
Yeah.
right? It looks like oral testimony, it looks like storytelling, it looks like sharing across generations. And so we have to work on privileging those knowledge systems too.
I can't help but think about the ways you've talked about your research, Dr. Buckingham, as occurring within communities with folks who don't look like you and who don't, for the most part, look like your students. And so training in that particular context feels like a
Mhm.
opportunity to do some really good work around the critical reflexivity that you're speaking to and about as well, but also that this should likely be a way that we think about that. What does it mean to have rigor in our research, in our psychological science? So I'm going to move on to another question, and that is to really think about our science. As psychologists whose work is so deeply impactful in very practical ways, can you share how you integrate our psychological science either through your own research or that of others, our colleagues, to advance evidence-based practices for the public good? What does that look like in your work? Dr. Jackson, I'll just help this along.
I know, sometimes flow is a little tricky as we're,
I get it.
I think
Yeah.
Dr. Buckingham's great things to say. I'm like, I want to hear what she says.
I know. I know.
Um, the first thing that came to mind, like I can talk about the work that I've like published recently,
Mhm.
but I also think of this idea of rigor and how technology is going to change that for some psychologists.
Okay.
Because most people, transparently, that I've talked to as psychologists, we are caught in this system that not everybody enjoys, writing research articles for one another to move us forward somehow in the
Well, now
space.
you're letting our secrets out the bag.
There's so many people, and honestly, I would encourage people to reflect how many people are actually even fully reading those articles versus skimming them to cite in their article.
Okay.
Um, and I think that it is one of those things that the more people leave almost an academic model in psychology, the
Mhm.
less that there is, they feel the value for some of this research work. And
Mhm.
I think it's also evidence of like how things are going to change. So there was recently, I cannot think, it wasn't a psychology journal, but there was a journal, and if you Google it, you'll see it was on X and all these things. They're talking about
Okay.
social media. The authors had submitted a paper,
Mm.
and went through peer, so they submitted it, went through peer review, they got to see preprint, all of these things,
Uh-huh.
and it got published. And somebody was reading it and realized that they had left their Chat GPT prompt in the very first sentence of the paper. And it sparked all of these conversations because people were like, so how did this go through peer review, editor review, preprint review by the authors? Like no one caught that the prompt, and the prompt really is, here's a potential title for your, like that, the very first line of the article. And to me, it is,
Wow.
exactly. It is, and I'm like, this to me is just the outcome of what people are saying in the sciences and academia, that people are doing this because it needs to be done, and less about if the people reviewing it and the people writing it are not as invested in like, let me see this. I mean, this is something that is a glaring thing. So it's not like, oh, you missed the in the very middle of the paper and somebody didn't catch that E. This is the first line of the paper. I think it speaks to like how this will start to change systems, because people will not be able to tell how people leverage technology to write papers. People will put out papers faster. We already have a dearth of people to review. Anybody who's ever, if you have gotten the emails, you get those emails that people are basically begging you to review something.
Yeah.
And I'm like, all of this to me is indicative of a shift that needs to happen when we think about rigor and what are the way that we think about how to get knowledge out. And so I give that example because I'm like, I think that we're also at a space where this is where psychologists can step in and show that there's other levels of rigor and a way to show expertise that is not in academic journal writing.
Oh my gosh, I have to just sort of take a moment because that is quite shocking, right? And I think that speaks to like a big fear that folks have. So I'm also in a higher ed institution, you know, and as we all, you know, have had that experience just to get our doctorate. And so, you know, I can tell you that one of the large questions that is coming up for many of us as it relates to artificial intelligence is this idea of academic integrity as well. And so my question here, and I'm not asking for either of you to respond to it, I think it's probably a loaded one, although if you have an opinion you want to share, please do, is there academic integrity? You both drink your tea at the same moment, okay. But does that have integrity? Does using ChatGPT suggest that a lack of integrity in the academic work? I feel like that's a large question for us to pose, not only for our students, because you can, and again, in academic settings, we're asking that about submission of student papers and whatnot, and we're trying to train students in the academic writing practice and processes. And Dr. Jackson, to your point, this becomes a type of labor that as you say, people don't enjoy or enjoy as much, as well as the review process and these elements. So does that also mean that there's possibly a lack of integrity on the part of the researcher, on the part of the scientist? I think it's a provocative question. Again, I'm not necessarily asking you to respond to it, but I think it begs the question at this point.
Yeah, I would like to respond if
Okay,
I could.
I mean, I feel like you might, but I didn't want to put you on the spot, but please do.
Yeah, and I want to be transparent. I still published there. I had an article that came out a few months ago. We just submitted one yesterday. So
Oh,
it's
okay.
still a part of a system that is publishing. And when people pose these questions, I push back on thinking about larger questions. Thinking about, we may feel like ChatGPT lacks integrity, but what about people who got PhDs in the 30s who had no computers, right? How would they think about the fact that we can very quickly pull articles, can very quickly scan them and highlight them on our computer and type it up and do all of these things when they had to physically go places, had less resources, and still had to publish it, right? I think what it pushes people to think about is, what are the skills that we need to evolve? How are we teaching people? I get the fear that people might lose critical thinking skills, but the question I'm asking people to think about is, as humans, do we need the same critical thinking skills throughout all of humanity, or does that need to change? Right, before a cell phone, you had to memorize phone numbers. Now we have cell phones that has an executive function that we don't need, which allows our brain to think about other things. I don't have to remember 75 phone numbers or MapQuest instructions I used to have to print out and hope I could drive and get to where I was going. Now I can go way more places because I can plug it into my GPS and get there. It actually helped us. So what are the skills we need to be teaching students and scholars and writers now about writing? I think anyone who is published will say the hardest part about academic writing isn't always the information, the content. It is kind of the writing skill. And if there's someone who can help you with that, can people think bigger, bolder ideas? And there's now a tool that helps them to get that out clearly, but the idea is still coming from them. something to think about.
You've aged me significantly. I know all about MapQuest and remembering phone numbers. And certainly thinking about the reliance of the writing skill on Western culture, right? So that if you are someone from a non-Western culture background in terms of, we're thinking about English as a second language or, just also linearity of thinking versus other ways of processing information cognitively that sort of comes up through a particular cultural tradition, you are not favored and therefore don't have a privilege that others who are reared and grow in that tradition do. And so we can definitely see where there might even be an equalizing factor in a way, or an equitalizing factor in a way. Sara, what would you like to say? I feel like you want to jump in.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you just brought that up too, because I was reading an article the other day that when people run plagiarism checks or checks for, something that might be crafted by ChatGPT, they're much more likely to flag language that is written by English language learners as opposed to people who were born into the language. And so I think it's really important that we're thinking about, like, how do we critically check for those things if we decide that? But to build off the point around our critical thinking skills, I might argue that we're not necessarily teaching the most useful critical thinking skills anyway. If ChatGPT is what we're using to answer questions, right? What ultimately we need to be asking people to do that really important critical reflexive work to understand what research is coming up and what we're considering to be truth in that space, because ChatGPT is just coming up with the things that are already out there, right? And replicating it for us. And so if we are to use a tool like that, we're doing the thing that we're asking our students oftentimes to do, right? Rather than asking them to think more broadly, or to ask ourselves to think more broadly about what is getting replicated out there in the world and how we're thinking about those things. So I think if we're scared of a tool like ChatGPT, it's because we're not necessarily polling for our students to really show us the things that we need to be able to solve our world problems, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm recognizing how provocative this conversation is. So I want to encourage those who are listening in, watching, to certainly pose a few questions. And if we have time, we'll respond to them. But feel free to pose them in the chat. This is very provocative. I imagine there will be a lot of reactions to this conversation, but it is of the moment, right? It is of the moment. So final question, I have to say, and we've talked about it a lot, like what you do is not necessarily a career path or professional path that was introduced to you in graduate school. I'm very curious about how you found your way. And if you could share a little bit about what that was. I'm very motivated and encouraged by the amount of student interest in my campaign and student engagement inside of, graduate students who are engaged in this conversation that we're having. And I know that as they're witnessing, just as Dr. Jackson, you say that we need to be thinking about the future and the tools that we need now, because we are not at a typewriter and someone else you're not dictating to someone, right? There's a whole thing, and we don't have to go places to get resources. It is all virtually and digitally available. What does that future look like? And so for the students who are coming through the pathway now, they are likely going to have a very different landscape. And I imagine they would see the two of you and your career path and just the very exciting work that you're able to do with some level of aspiration. How did you get here? Let's talk to graduate students and early career folks who, have also been told it's research and it's clinical practice. And how did you all get to do what you're doing? Let's lay some breadcrumbs for them, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first thing I would say, Wendi, is I think it's okay if we have provocative conversations also, because I think that I speak, my goal is not to get you to think the way I think, but it's to get you to think. And I think that's also
right. Yes.
like, if people are having conversations, that's how we get to solving problems, is through having conversations, talking them out. So I hope that people do think about, because these are issues, right? And I think this is a great space for grad students to start thinking big, think large. I think about it in the terms of you know, all that I knew in grad school when it comes to research is like NIH grants and NIMH grants and SAMHSA. And it was like research, get a R1, get a K. That was what people push. And I'm sure people have heard of this before, but I did not until I came to the tech space of hearing of like ARPA H grants. And I was like, oh, you will fund people to think about things and they don't have to have a full plan. And there's so much money available and they're just looking for innovation. And I'm like, those are the things that I wish I had learned more of as grad school. I think we get pushed into almost like a narrow way of thinking of what psychologist is. And I think in a misguided way, if people want to really know what's the difference between a psychologist and somebody who is not a psychologist, who may be only licensed at the master's level or trained at the master's level, not even always licensed, because now psychologists are licensed, but I think it's a way of like establishing our identity. I encourage students to think about the why you go to grad school. Whenever I talk to students, I tell them, like, what is your purpose for going? And it doesn't have to be some like amazing. My purpose, my very first day in our PhD program, they asked us why we were there. And I was honest and said, because in my community, Mrs. Jackson talking to you about schizophrenia and Dr. Jackson talking to you about schizophrenia will make a huge difference. Like, we're going to want a second opinion. And as a Black woman at the time, especially coming into a community and wanting to work with people on mental health, they want to feel like you're an expert. And so if this degree gives people a level of comfort to then get the treatment interventions they needed, that's what I wanted to do. That was my sole reason for going to grad school. I did not say I want to publish and I want to do, you know, research and all these amazing things. And I remember somebody saying to me, they're like, you took someone's spot, like after I gave my reason. And I was like, oh, I took it so much as like, they felt like I needed to be here. Like my reason doesn't have to be your reason. And I encourage grad students, because I think that's what we're socialized sometimes, it's that you have to have some grand, magnificent reason to change the world to go to grad school. And it could be as simple as like what you're seeing for your community. And the other piece of advice I would just add is that it is okay also to be a generalist. I think we are trained as psychologists to immediately pick a niche. Who's your lab? Who's your advisor? This is the work you do, stay there. And I did not. I also had a master's degree and had been thinking about like, what is the clinical work I want to do? And so I changed advisors in grad school. I switched what my niche was. I started out looking at juvenile justice because that's what I had done in my master's, and started working with athletes and race-related stress and things like that. And when I was applying for internship, I was told frequently, your experience is too general. You've done too many things, but that's actually what benefits me in my career, is that I have worked in these different settings, that I do bring these different experiences. And so I say that to students is like, people, they only know what they know. They don't know everything. And so what grounded me was remembering my why. I have a sign on my desk that I've had since grad school that says, remember why you started. And that was to help people in my community. So I'm like, every experience I did, it was like, if this will help people in my community, I will do it. And it was less about, I'm gonna need this for internship, or I will need this for a job. And those things have just aligned and worked out for me. And encourage grad students to think about, what is the broader lane that you don't have to specialize to still be able to figure it out? Because the things that I'm doing now weren't even options when I was a student. So I had no idea that these opportunities would open up for those skills. You never know what will open up if you're following the things you're passionate about.
It's very powerful. I don't have anything to say. Dr. Buckingham, please.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly concur. Oftentimes when students are like designing a study or working with folks on a study, I ask them to think about what they want the implications of that work to be. Like, what are they, what's going to be done with it, to get to what they actually want to do. I want to go back maybe a little bit earlier than you were asking, Wendi. Absolutely. And when I think about my path, I came to this work from the substance use world. I worked in substance use after I got a bachelor's degree, because in the state of Colorado, you don't need any degree beyond, you don't even need a bachelor's to work as an addictions counselor. And I was working as a Spanish-speaking addictions counselor, working mostly with immigrant populations from Mexico, from Central America. And I discovered that I became a cog in a very unjust immigration system, unbeknownst to me. This was when ICE was first formed and immigration, customs enforcement were actually doing large scale raids where I lived, and our criminal justice system in the state of Colorado actually collaborated with immigration and customs enforcement in order to have people placed into immigration holds after they had completed court mandated treatment. And so I had a client once call me telling me that he wasn't coming back for services, but he wanted me to know that he was okay because he needed to go on the run in order to avoid deportation. And as you can imagine, as like a 22-year-old, I was faced with a very different set of life circumstances that I had just never understood, and did not understand the harm that I was doing because of the system that I was working in. And that's really what drew me to community psychology, because community psychology is all about how do we understand these broader levels that end up shaping individual and collective well-being. And it was actually through relationships that I managed to discover that community psychology was a thing. I had no idea community psychology was a thing. And I think that is really powerful, and something that all of us have to remember when we're working in spaces. The relationships that we have with people that are coming into the fold are incredibly important, and any one line that we might share with someone, or any relationship we might have with someone, even if it's in passing, can make a huge difference in whether someone goes on to move in particular pathways. And so one of the things that I really encourage for students and for all of us is to think about, like, what are those relationships that we're fostering? Who are we seeking out relationships with? And how are we in those relationships in order to figure out what pathways we want to move in. The whole reason that I ended up on the APA Council of Representatives is because a mentor, an informal mentor, had been previously served in that role, and said, I really think that you should go for this. This would be, useful. And I think you'd be good in this role. And it was something that had never crossed my mind, and would have never crossed my mind if I wouldn't have had that relationship. And so that's really important, is to remember that connectedness is oftentimes what moves us in these different directions. And I also think that it's also all about information. And Dr. Jackson spoke to this to some degree already, that we don't know what we don't know. We have no idea what that future is going to look like. We don't know how our skills are going to be brought to bear, but some of us know more than others about how systems operate at this point in time, right? And so many people are locked out of the systems that we need them in order to have transformation. And so a lot of, I think, our work, especially for those of us in higher education, is to pull back the black curtain and make people understand, like, how do these systems function? How do they work? How can you at once push against the system to have the important system change that we need, while also navigating systems that are oftentimes oppressive and less useful and very convoluted, in order to be able to get through too. It's that, like, both and that I think is really a tricky balance that we have to walk, but really important for those of us in this field to do.
I'm really just so appreciative of how both of your stories, and thank you for going back there in terms of just memory and your early years and what inspired you, but also, and I think that this is what is important for graduate students, folks even be thinking about what they might want to do in graduate school before they even get there, as well as early career psychologists, that what is inspiring you is what we actually need in the future. That's what I'm hearing so importantly from each of you. I'm thinking of my own origin story as well, and how it's still so very true, the animating force by which I am doing everything, and how important that is. And when you are a young person, when you're sort of a lowly graduate student, as some of us might have felt at different times, or even, assistant professor or just getting started, you may not feel that there is as much value in what that nugget of what you're thinking, but it's exactly what we need. We actually need you to go with the nugget. Like, please go with the first thought, because you're our future. You really are. And we need you to do it. We have one question I do think that we have time to ask or respond to. So it comes from Dr. Bedford Palmer. Dr. Palmer, thank you so much for being here with us and supporting our first conversation. He says, thinking about Dr. Jackson's concept of psychologists as conduits of healing versus being healers. I wonder what the panel's thoughts are in terms of balancing the communal understanding of our work with ensuring that we do not abdicate the ethical responsibilities that come with the privilege of our role. Also, when pulling back from being the authority, how do we contend with the ongoing marginalization of our work? And some of those pieces include insurance parity, the idea of psychology being a soft science, and I'm sure that we can identify others. Dr. Jackson, I will please.
Yeah. To be clear, I still think we need to be in authority. I think we need to reimagine what that might look like.
Okay.
I do see psychologists in this space right now. If you all have heard the analogy about holding sand, if you hold it loosely, it stays, but the more that you hold it, it drains out. That is how I see how psychologists are holding on to their identity right now, is we're trying so hard to hold on to it that we're losing some of the things because we're not paying attention to actually what we need to add in. And I think about it in the role of, if you think about a CEO, they're still the authority, they're still the expert, but the engine does not stop running because they are not there. CEOs get replaced all of the time. They're the conduit to the knowledge. They bring in the right people. They help everything run. You need a CEO, but they are not the only thing that keeps the company running.
Right.
For me, that is how I see psychologists when I say it's the conduit and not the healer, is that you need us, but we are not the only thing that allows the healing to happen. We're not the only reason that people get better. It's like, how do we bring in these other things, like as the CEO of a company or of something? And I think about, and I will say this might be a little too provocative, radical, but I think about some of the criticisms we get as psychologists is because we are the only healthcare field where you do all of the things in grad school: research, clinical work, and coursework. It is almost like a phenomenon when you see an MD who has done research, because it's not required, right? They can do programs. You think of DNPs, nurses, and PharmDs, and all these people who go to grad school, they have a focus, which makes them the expert, and people trust that. And then the other things feel like they're add-ons. In psychology, we are trained to think we're the experts in everything, which I think is part of the criticism, is that people are like, well, how are you able to do all of that so well?
Yeah.
And I think that that is one of the things that causes us, people are like, well, how do you do, that's why it's a soft science, because they're like, well, how do you have time to do that and see people and do coursework and do this, because they can't understand it. And I'm like, it is a lot. We are trying to be the experts of everything at once, right? So long-winded answer to try to answer that question, but that's kind of how I see it a little bit.
No, and I want to say that I have already leaned into your invitation to being provocative. So thank you for the doorway. Dr. Buckingham, would you like to add anything to that? With Dr. Palmer's, his question, I think, is pretty provocative in itself. It really asks us about the edges of our work. What do you think?
It is. I agree wholeheartedly with what Dr. Jackson is saying. I'll also add that I think it's a both and, where in some ways we have to play the game, right? We have to work within the systems that we are placed in. And some of us do that, we have to do that work. And I don't think that's a dirty thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. But at the same time, it can't be all that we do, right? We also have to work towards systems change, and to work against some of these pressures as a collective in order for us to not fall into the trap of doing the same thing that's ineffective over time. And it's also about creating space for ourselves in other places and to do new things. One of the things that I find most exciting about the state that I live in is that there are very few of us that are psychologists here. But because of that, graduates of a clinical community psychology program are oftentimes the heads of a lot of the institutions in our state, and are able to really craft new ways for psychology to come into the fold, to be able to change how we show up in the work that we do, so it isn't so granular. And it's because psychologists are creating spaces for one another too. So it's a both and.
Oh my gosh. I want to say thank you so much to the two of you. You have really given us, just with your energy, your insight, your expertise, such a lovely kickoff to these Wednesdays with Wendi conversations, with Dr. Wendi conversations, and really have helped, I think, to really illuminate and truly illustrate what is possible when psychologists are doing this expansive community-based focused work with that local expertise and attention, but also through the lens of your expertise as psychologists, and really, I guess, again, rather grappling with some of those provocative questions that are at the edge of our field and that we're walking into that future with. So I know that I feel very just honored for your presence. I really thank you for your time and your yes. I'm very appreciative of your yes. And so that is what I will say. Coming up, May 8th will be our next session, Wednesdays with Wendi. So these are once a month, the first Wednesday each month. And we're going to focus on youth mental health. I'll have doctors Miriam Jernigan-Noesi, Dr. Nayeli Chavez-Dueñez, and Dr. Erlanger Turner. So I cannot wait to talk with you all and to bring in some of our work and the initiatives coming from our platform, my platform, Radically Well Together, for my presidential platform through the lens of youth mental health and mental and wellness. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.